Who's the craziest ex you've ever had to deal with? I was handcuffed in my own kitchen when I realized my ex-girlfriend had been living in my attic for 3 weeks. The detective holding the warrant kept asking me where I'd hidden the laptop, and I kept saying I didn't own a laptop. I had a desktop in my office, and that's when I heard it. A sneeze. From directly above us. From a part of my house that was supposed to be empty crawl space. Detective Robert Finch's eyes went to the ceiling, then back to me, and I watched his hand move to his holster. That sneeze saved my life, my career, and possibly my freedom, because the laptop they were looking for, the one that had been used to send death threats to a federal judge, was probably up there with her. I need to back up 6 months to when this nightmare actually started, back when Melissa Vance seemed like the best thing that ever happened to me. We met at a charity fundraiser in Portland where I was representing my firm, a mid-sized accounting company that handled clients across the Pacific Northwest. She was a graphic designer, funny and charming, with this infectious energy that made everyone in the room gravitate toward her. We dated for 8 months, and honestly, those first 6 were incredible. She was attentive, creative, always planning these elaborate date nights and surprising me with little gifts. My friends loved her, my parents thought she was great, and I was genuinely considering proposing. But then the small cracks started showing, hairline fractures in what I thought was a perfect relationship that would eventually shatter everything I'd built. It started with her phone. She became obsessive about it, constantly checking it, angling the screen away from me when notifications came through. When I asked about it casually one night over dinner, she snapped at me with an intensity that seemed completely disproportionate to the question. She accused me of being controlling, of not trusting her, of being just like her ex who had monitored her every move. I apologized immediately, told her I didn't mean anything by it, that I was just making conversation. She calmed down, apologized for overreacting, blamed it on stress from a difficult client at work. I accepted that explanation because I wanted to believe it. I told myself everyone has bad days, everyone has triggers from past relationships. I should have recognized that moment for what it really was, the first glimpse behind the mask she'd been wearing since we met. The second incident happened 3 weeks later when I came home from a weekend fishing trip with my college friends. I'd told her about the trip weeks in advance. She'd seemed fine with it, even helped me pack my gear. But when I walked through my front door on Sunday evening, my apartment had been completely rearranged. The furniture was in different positions. My books were reorganized by color instead of author, and all my photographs had been taken down and replaced with framed pictures of the two of us. When I asked her about it, standing in my living room that no longer felt like mine, she seemed genuinely confused by my reaction. She said she'd wanted to surprise me, to make the space feel more like ours instead of just mine. She'd used the spare key I'd given her for emergencies, had spent the entire weekend transforming my home into something unrecognizable. I felt violated, but I also felt guilty for feeling violated. Because wasn't this what girlfriends did? Wasn't this sweet and romantic? So I thanked her, hugged her, and ignored the churning in my stomach that told me this wasn't normal, this wasn't okay. The breaking point came 2 months later, and it wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet and sad and absolutely necessary. I'd noticed she was tracking my location constantly through the phone-sharing app we'd both agreed to use for safety. She knew where I was at all times, would text me minutes after I arrived anywhere asking who I was with and what I was doing. She'd started showing up unannounced at my office, at the gym, at my friend's house during game nights. She wanted passwords to all my social media accounts, access to my email, insisted on being included in every aspect of my life. I felt like I was drowning, like I couldn't breathe without her permission. One Wednesday evening in September, I sat her down in my apartment and told her as gently as I could that this wasn't working, that I needed space, that we wanted different things from a relationship. She cried, begged me to reconsider, promised she'd change, that she'd give me more freedom. But I held firm because I knew if I didn't end it then, I never would. She left that night, took the few things she'd kept at my place, and I thought that was it. I thought I'd dodged a bullet, that I'd get to move on with my life and chalk this up to a relationship that just didn't work out. I had no idea the real nightmare was just beginning, that the woman I'd dated for 8 months had been carefully studying me, learning my patterns and habits and routines, gathering information she would later weaponize in ways I couldn't have imagined. The woman I thought I knew didn't exist at all. Melissa Vance was a carefully constructed persona, and what lived underneath was something far more dangerous. The first week after the breakup was quiet, too quiet. No texts, no calls, no attempts to change my mind. I was relieved, but also slightly unnerved because it seemed too easy, too clean. Then my credit card was declined at a restaurant on a Friday night. I checked my banking app and saw that someone had charged $8,000 to my account at various electronics stores across the city, all within a 3-hour window that afternoon. I immediately called the bank, reported the fraud, and started the process of getting new cards issued. The bank's fraud investigator, a woman named Jennifer Cross, told me this was becoming increasingly common, that I should check my credit report and consider freezing my credit. I did both that weekend, and that's when I discovered someone had opened 4 new credit cards in my name, taken out a personal loan for $15,000, and attempted to lease a luxury vehicle using my information. I filed a police report on Monday morning, met with Officer David Huang at the downtown precinct. He was sympathetic, but not particularly optimistic about catching whoever had done this. Identity theft cases were notoriously difficult to solve unless the perpetrator was sloppy or unless there was clear surveillance footage. He took my statement, gave me a case number, and told me to keep detailed records of everything. I left the police station feeling helpless and angry, wondering who could have gotten access to enough of my personal information to do this kind of damage. I didn't suspect Melissa yet, because I didn't want to believe someone I'd cared about could do something so cruel. I convinced myself it was random, that my information had been compromised in some data breach, that this had nothing to do with her. But then my car was keyed 3 days later in my office parking lot. Deep, deliberate gouges that spelled out "liar" across the driver's side door. The security cameras in the parking lot had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. A technical glitch according to building management that meant there was no footage of who had done it. The repair cost me $1,200 after insurance, and that's when the first tendril of suspicion started creeping into my mind. This felt personal. This felt targeted. I thought about Melissa, about how she'd known where I worked, about how she'd shown up at this parking lot dozens of times during our relationship. But I still didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that correlation didn't equal causation, that just because we'd broken up didn't mean she was vandalizing my car. The emails started the following week. They came from an account I didn't recognize, long rambling messages about how I'd ruined everything, how I'd promised forever and then abandoned her, how I deserved to suffer the way she was suffering. They weren't overtly threatening, but they were deeply unsettling, full of specific details about our relationship that only Melissa would know. I forwarded them to Officer Huang, who told me to document everything, but that unless the emails contained explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I get a restraining order if I felt genuinely threatened. I considered it, spent hours researching the process, but ultimately decided against it because I didn't want to escalate things. I thought if I just ignored her, she'd eventually move on. That was perhaps the stupidest decision I made in this entire ordeal. Things escalated rapidly over the next month. My Netflix account was accessed from an unknown device, and all my preferences were changed. Small items started disappearing from my apartment. A book here, a coffee mug there, my favorite jacket that I'd left hanging by the door. I changed my locks, installed a basic security camera at my front door, and started feeling genuinely paranoid about my own safety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was tracking my movements and routines. My work performance started suffering because I was constantly distracted, constantly anxious. My boss, Gerald Novak, pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was dealing with some personal issues, but that I'd get it under control. He was understanding, but I could see the concern in his eyes, the worry that I was becoming a liability. Then Melissa called me from a number I didn't recognize on a Thursday night in October. Her voice was eerily calm, almost cheerful, like we were old friends catching up. She asked how I was doing, said she'd been thinking about me, wondered if I wanted to grab coffee and talk about things. I told her firmly but politely that I didn't think that was a good idea, that we'd both moved on and should keep it that way. She laughed, this bright, tinkling laugh that made my skin crawl, and said something that I still remember word for word. She said, "Nathan, you really don't understand what you've done, do you? You don't get to just throw people away and expect them to disappear. I'm not going anywhere. I'm always going to be part of your life now, whether you want me to be or not." Then she hung up. I immediately called Officer Huang and reported the call, added it to my growing file of evidence. He finally agreed that I should pursue a restraining order. I met with attorney Catherine Brennan the following Monday. She was a family law specialist who handled restraining orders and domestic disputes, came highly recommended by a colleague at work. She was in her late 40s, sharp and no nonsense, with 23 years of experience dealing with cases like mine. I sat in her office and laid out everything that had happened over the past 2 months, showed her the emails and police reports and bank statements. She listened carefully, took detailed notes, and then looked at me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and concern. She told me I had more than enough evidence for a restraining order, that the pattern of behavior I'd described constituted stalking and harassment under state law. But she also warned me that restraining orders could sometimes make things worse, that they could escalate the situation if the person being restrained felt cornered or humiliated. I told her I understood the risks, but that I needed to do something because I couldn't keep living like this. We filed the petition that afternoon. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, which meant Melissa would be served with notice and have the opportunity to respond. Attorney Brennan warned me to be extra vigilant during this period, to vary my routines, to make sure my security cameras were working, to tell friends and family what was happening so they could be aware. I followed her advice, started taking different routes to work, stopped going to my usual gym and grocery store, told my parents and closest friends about the situation. They were all shocked and supportive, offered to help in whatever way they could. My best friend David Kowalski started checking in on me daily, insisted on coming over to my apartment a few times a week just to make sure I was okay. Having that support system made me feel less alone, less like I was going crazy. The night before the restraining order hearing, someone broke into my apartment. I'd gone to bed around 11, had checked all the locks and windows, made sure my security camera was recording. I woke up at 3:15 in the morning to the sound of something crashing in my kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack right there in my bed. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment. She stayed on the line with me, told me to stay in my bedroom with the door locked until police arrived. I could hear movement in the other room, drawers opening and closing, the refrigerator door, footsteps moving through my living room. The 4 minutes it took for police to arrive felt like 4 hours. When they finally burst through my front door, whoever had been inside was gone. My back window was wide open, the screen removed and lying on the ground outside. The responding officers, a pair of young patrol cops named Lisa Garrett and Thomas Wu, searched my apartment thoroughly. Nothing appeared to be stolen. In fact, things had been added. There were photos of Melissa and me from our relationship scattered across my coffee table. Photos I'd never seen before that she must have taken without my knowledge. Close-ups of me sleeping, photos of me at work through the office window, pictures of me at the gym and the grocery store and my parents' house. She'd been following me, documenting me, for months, maybe even before we'd broken up. The officers collected the photos as evidence, took statements, dusted for prints. They found nothing useful. Melissa had been careful, had worn gloves, had left no physical trace of herself except these photographs that proved she'd been stalking me long before I'd even realized it. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat on my couch with all the lights on, jumping at every sound, my phone clutched in my hand in case I needed to call for help again. The sun coming up felt like a blessing, like I'd survived something even though nothing had actually happened to me. Attorney Brennan called me at 8 in the morning, had already heard about the break-in from the police report that had been filed. She told me this actually strengthened our case for the restraining order, that a judge would take this very seriously. The hearing was scheduled for 2 that afternoon. I took the day off work, spent the morning at the police station giving another statement to Officer Huang, who was now taking my case much more seriously. He assigned a detective to investigate, a veteran cop named Robert Finch, who'd worked stalking cases for over 15 years. Detective Finch was a tall man in his mid-50s with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He sat across from me in an interview room and listened to my entire story from beginning to end, asking clarifying questions, taking meticulous notes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and said something that chilled me to my core. He said, "Mr. Carver, I've worked dozens of stalking cases over my career, and what you're describing fits a very specific and very dangerous pattern. Your ex-girlfriend isn't just hurt or angry, she's obsessed. People like this don't respond well to boundaries or legal orders. They see restraining orders as challenges, as obstacles to overcome. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to prepare you. Things might get worse before they get better." I asked him what I should do, how I could protect myself. He recommended I consider staying somewhere else for a while, maybe with family or friends, at least until we could establish what Melissa's next move would be. The restraining order hearing was surreal. Melissa showed up with her own attorney, a sleazy-looking guy in an expensive suit, who immediately started making arguments about how I was the one harassing her, how I was making false accusations to cover up my own abusive behavior during our relationship. Melissa sat there looking demure and wounded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the victim perfectly. But Attorney Brennan was prepared. She presented the police reports, the emails, the photos that had been left in my apartment, phone records showing Melissa's repeated calls from different numbers. The judge, an older woman named Honor Patricia Novak, listened to everything with a stern expression. When Melissa's attorney tried to argue that the photos could have been planted, that there was no proof his client had broken into my apartment, Judge Novak cut him off. She granted the temporary restraining order, ordered Melissa to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace, and scheduled a follow-up hearing in 30 days to determine if it should be made permanent. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I left the courthouse, but Detective Finch's warnings echoed in my head. This wasn't over. If anything, it might be just beginning. I took his advice and moved in with my parents temporarily, a humbling experience for a 32-year-old man, but one that felt necessary for my safety. My dad, a retired firefighter named William Carver, took the situation seriously and installed additional security measures at their house, cameras and motion sensors and better locks. My mom, Susan, was more worried than I'd ever seen her, kept asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was anything more they could do. I assured them I was fine, that the restraining order would help, that things would calm down now. I desperately wanted to believe that. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No emails, no calls, no signs of Melissa anywhere. I started to relax, started to think maybe the restraining order had actually worked, that she'd finally gotten the message and backed off. I moved back into my apartment, went back to my normal routines, tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy in my life. Work was going better, my boss was pleased with my recent projects, and I even went on a date with a woman I'd met through a friend. Life felt like it was returning to something manageable. I should have known better. I should have recognized the quiet for what it was, the calm before the storm. The detective showed up at my office on a Monday morning in early November with a warrant for my arrest. I was sitting at my desk reviewing quarterly reports when our receptionist called and told me there were police officers in the lobby asking to speak with me. I assumed it was Officer Huang with an update on the case, so I went down to meet them without any concern. Instead, I found Detective Finch with 2 uniformed officers and an expression on his face that told me something was very, very wrong. He asked me to step outside, and once we were in the parking lot, he informed me that I was being charged with cyberstalking and making terroristic threats against a federal judge. I actually laughed because I thought it was some kind of mistake, some bureaucratic mix-up, but his face remained deadly serious. He explained that emails had been sent from an IP address traced back to my home internet connection to Judge Patricia Novak, the same judge who had granted my restraining order against Melissa. The emails contained graphic threats against the judge and her family, detailed descriptions of violence, and specific information about her home address and daily schedule. I told him that was impossible, that I would never do something like that I didn't even own a laptop, and all my internet activity was through my desktop computer in my home office. He said they had a warrant to search my apartment and seize my electronic devices. I told him to go ahead, that he'd find nothing because I hadn't done this. But even as I said it, a terrible realization was beginning to dawn on me. Melissa. This had to be Melissa. We drove to my apartment in separate vehicles, Detective Finch in an unmarked car with me following behind in my own car, fighting the urge to flee even though I'd done nothing wrong. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through possibilities. How could she have sent emails from my IP address? Had she somehow hacked my internet? Was she using my Wi-Fi? The questions spiraled and multiplied as we pulled into my apartment complex. The detective and his team entered my apartment with their warrant, and I stood in my kitchen feeling helpless and terrified as they searched through my belongings, looking for evidence of a crime I didn't commit. That's when I heard it. The sneeze. From above us. From the attic space that was supposed to be empty. Detective Finch drew his weapon and called for backup. 2 more officers arrived within minutes, and they accessed the attic through a pull-down ladder in my hallway closet. I'd never used that ladder in the 3 years I'd lived there, had assumed it just led to empty storage space, but as the officers climbed up with their flashlights, I heard shouting and then more movement. They brought Melissa down 5 minutes later. She was dirty and disheveled, her hair matted, wearing clothes I recognized as mine that she must have taken during one of her break-ins, and she was holding a laptop, the laptop they'd been looking for, the one used to send those threats. The attic had been converted into a makeshift living space. She had a sleeping bag, food supplies, bottles for waste, and a sophisticated camera and monitoring system that covered every room of my apartment. She'd been watching me for weeks, listening to my phone calls, monitoring my computer usage, living in the space above my head while I slept and ate and worked directly below her. The officers found detailed notes she'd written about my daily routines, plans for future harassment, and drafts of additional threatening emails she'd planned to send. She'd used my Wi-Fi to send the threats, had carefully timed them for when I was provably elsewhere, so that suspicion would fall on me, but I'd have alibis. Her plan had been to get me arrested, to destroy my career and my life, to make me suffer the way she believed I'd made her suffer. Detective Finch had me taken to the station to give a formal statement while Melissa was arrested and charged with multiple felonies including stalking, burglary, identity theft, making terroristic threats, and cyberstalking. I sat in that interview room for 3 hours, detailing everything that had happened over the past months, providing timeline and evidence and context. The detective kept apologizing, telling me he should have taken the threat more seriously, should have considered that she might be living in my space. I told him it wasn't his fault, that no one could have predicted this level of obsession and dedication. He told me I'd likely be called as a witness when this went to trial, that the case against her was extremely strong given what they'd found in my attic. The forensic psychologist who evaluated Melissa for the court, Dr. Michael Thornton, diagnosed her with erotomania, a delusional disorder where a person believes another person is in love with them, despite clear evidence to the contrary. In his report, which I was eventually able to read, he described how Melissa had constructed an elaborate fantasy where our relationship was destined and eternal, where my breaking up with her was just a test of her devotion that she needed to overcome. She had genuinely believed that if she could just prove how much she loved me, if she could just remove all the obstacles between us, I would come back to her. The identity theft, the stalking, even living in my attic, all of it was part of this delusional narrative she'd constructed. Dr. Thornton concluded she was not fit to stand trial and recommended psychiatric hospitalization. Melissa was committed to a secure psychiatric facility for an indefinite period, deemed a danger to herself and others. The judge at her competency hearing, a different judge named Lawrence Freeman, ordered that she remain in treatment until medical professionals determined she was no longer a threat and could understand the charges against her. The criminal charges remained pending, waiting for the day she might be competent to face them. Attorney Brennan helped me pursue a civil lawsuit against Melissa for damages, and we were awarded a significant judgment, though collecting on it seemed unlikely given her circumstances. The money wasn't really the point anyway. The point was the official recognition that what she'd done to me was wrong, was criminal, was a violation of every boundary and trust that should exist between people. The aftermath was complicated and messy, and far from the clean resolution I'd hoped for. I had to completely move out of my apartment because I couldn't sleep there anymore, knowing she'd been above me for weeks, Every creak and sound made me panic, sent my heart racing. I found a new place across town, a first-floor unit with no attic and extensive security systems. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rachel Kowalski, who specialized in trauma from stalking and domestic abuse. She helped me process what had happened, helped me understand that none of this was my fault, that I couldn't have known or prevented the extent of Melissa's obsession. The therapy was hard, forcing me to confront feelings of violation and helplessness, and fear that I'd been trying to push down and ignore. My credit took months to repair, despite all the police reports and court documents proving I was a victim of identity theft. The credit bureaus required extensive documentation, endless phone calls, certified letters, and patience I barely had. The total financial damage was somewhere around $45,000 once you factored in the fraudulent charges, the legal fees, the moving costs, the increased security measures, and the therapy. My insurance covered some of it. The court judgment theoretically covered more. But the reality was, I'd probably never see that money. I had to accept that this had cost me not just emotionally and psychologically, but financially as well. Work was understanding, but there were limits to their patience. Gerald Novak called me into his office 6 months after Melissa's arrest and told me that while he sympathized with what I'd been through, I needed to demonstrate that I was fully present and committed to my job again. My performance had improved since the worst of the crisis, but I was still distracted, still sometimes short with colleagues, still occasionally unreliable when my anxiety spiked. He gave me a formal warning, told me he needed to see consistent improvement over the next quarter, or we'd need to discuss my future with the firm. It was a wake-up call I needed. I doubled down on my work, put in extra hours, volunteered for the difficult assignments no one else wanted. Slowly, I rebuilt my professional reputation. The permanent restraining order was granted without Melissa present since she was still in psychiatric care. It would remain in effect for 10 years, prohibiting any contact between us directly or through third parties. Detective Finch told me that given her mental state and the serious nature of her crimes, it was likely she'd remain institutionalized for a very long time, possibly indefinitely. That should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her to somehow escape or be released or find some new way to insert herself into my life. Dr. Kowalski worked with me on managing these fears, on distinguishing between reasonable caution and paralyzing anxiety. It was a process, one I'm still working through even now. Dating again felt impossible for a long time. The idea of trusting someone, of letting them into my life and my space, of making myself vulnerable, it all seemed too risky and too painful. But gradually, with Dr. Kowalski's encouragement, I started putting myself out there again. I was upfront with potential partners about what had happened, figured it was better to scare them off early than to have them discover it later. Most women were understanding and sympathetic. Some were scared off by the drama, and a few were oddly fascinated in a way that made me uncomfortable. I dated casually for a while, nothing serious, just trying to remember how to connect with another person without constant fear and suspicion. It's been 18 months since Melissa was arrested. She remains in the psychiatric facility with no projected release date. I receive quarterly updates from the facility's patient advocate as part of the court order, informing me of her status and ensuring I'm notified if anything changes. The last update indicated she's made some progress in treatment, but still maintains delusional beliefs about our relationship, still doesn't fully accept responsibility for her actions. Dr. Thornton, who continues to oversee her care, recommended she remain hospitalized for the foreseeable future. That news should relieve me, and it does on some level. But it's also sad and complicated because this is a human being whose mind betrayed her so completely that she destroyed her entire life. I still have nightmares sometimes, wake up convinced I hear footsteps above my bed, even though I'm on the first floor now with nothing but sky above me. I still check my locks multiple times before bed, still feel a spike of anxiety when I get unexpected emails or phone calls, still scan crowds looking for her face, even though I know she's locked away. Dr. Kowalski says this is normal, that trauma rewires your brain in ways that take time to heal. She's taught me grounding techniques for when the anxiety spikes, helped me build a support network of people who understand what I've been through. My parents have been incredible, checking in regularly, never making me feel weak or broken for struggling. The thing no one tells you about surviving something like this is that there's no clean ending, no moment where everything suddenly becomes okay again. You just wake up one day and realize you didn't think about it for an hour, then a morning, then a whole day. The space between the intrusive thoughts and the panic attacks gradually expands until they're no longer the defining feature of your existence. You learn to live with the scars, to integrate what happened into your story without letting it become your entire story. I'm not the same person I was before Melissa. I'm not sure I'd want to be, but I'm also not the terrified, broken man I was 18 months ago. I've started dating someone seriously for the first time since everything happened. Her name is Amanda Sinclair, and she's a veterinarian I met through a friend's birthday party. I told her everything on our third date, figured if it was going to scare her off, it should happen sooner rather than later. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, asked thoughtful questions, and then told me she appreciated my honesty and wanted to keep seeing me. We've been together for 4 months now, taking things slowly, building trust gradually. She's patient with my anxiety, understanding about my need for security and clear communication, and she's never made me feel damaged or broken. I'm learning that it's possible to heal, to trust again, to build something new even after something so terrible. My career has stabilized and even improved. The firm promoted me to senior associate last month, a recognition of the hard work I'd put in rebuilding my reputation and my performance. Gerald Novak pulled me aside after the announcement and told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything, that I'd shown real resilience and character. It meant more to me than he probably knew, this acknowledgement that I'd survived and overcome rather than been destroyed. I mentor junior associates now, try to be the kind of supportive supervisor I needed during the worst of my crisis. I'm open about mental health and work-life balance in ways that might have seemed weak before, but now just seem human. The financial damage is mostly repaired. I paid off the last of the fraudulent debt 6 months ago. My credit score has recovered to where it was before Melissa destroyed it, and I've even started saving again. The apartment I live in now costs more than my old place, but I sleep better here, feel safer here. I've decorated it deliberately, made it mine in ways I never bothered to before, claimed this space as my own. I have friends over regularly, host game nights and dinner parties, fill the rooms with laughter and normal human interaction. I'm rebuilding a life that feels authentic and secure, one careful choice at a time. Detective Finch calls me occasionally to check in, tells me updates about the case even though there's rarely anything new to report. He's become something of an unexpected ally, someone who witnessed the worst of it and still sees me as a survivor rather than a victim. He told me recently that my case changed how his department approaches stalking investigations, that they take threats more seriously now and move faster on protective orders. It's a strange comfort to think that something good came from this nightmare, that maybe my experience will help protect someone else down the line. He encouraged me to speak publicly about what happened, to help raise awareness about stalking and obsessive behavior. I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe someday. But for now, I'm still focused on my own healing. The person I am now understands things the old Nathan never could have grasped. I understand that you can do everything right and still have terrible things happen to you. That trust is both essential and risky. That the people who seem the most perfect are sometimes the most dangerous because they're the best at hiding their true nature. I understand that safety is partially illusion, that control is mostly myth, that all we can really do is try our best and hope it's enough. These are hard lessons. Ones I wish I'd never had to learn, but they've made me more careful without making me cynical, more cautious without becoming closed off. I'm grateful for that balance, for the ability to move forward without forgetting what happened. The restraining order still has 8.5 years remaining. Melissa is still institutionalized with no release date. The laptop used to threaten Judge Novak is in evidence lockup, a physical reminder of how far she'd been willing to go. The photos she took of me while I slept have been destroyed per court order, but the memory of seeing them scattered across my coffee table still makes my stomach turn. Some images you can't unsee, some violations you can't unfeel. But I'm learning to live with these memories, to acknowledge them without being controlled by them. Dr. Kowalski calls this integration, this process of making peace with the past while still moving toward the future. I went back to my old apartment building recently, drove past it on the way to visit a friend in that neighborhood. The building looked the same from the outside, completely normal and unremarkable. No one looking at it would know that someone had lived in the attic of Unit 304 for 3 weeks, monitoring and stalking the tenant below. The current residents probably have no idea about the history of that space, and that's probably for the best. I felt nothing looking at it, no surge of fear or anger or trauma, just a mild acknowledgement of what had happened there, and gratitude that I no longer lived in that space. It felt like progress, like healing, like evidence that I was truly moving forward. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd survive this, that I'd be in a healthy relationship and excelling at my career and genuinely happy most days, I wouldn't have believed them. The man being handcuffed in his own kitchen while his ex-girlfriend was pulled from his attic couldn't have imagined a future where any of this felt manageable. But here I am, living that future, building that life. The scars are still there. The vigilance is still necessary, but they don't define me anymore. I define myself now by how I've rebuilt, by the relationships I've nurtured, by the work I've done both professionally and personally to become someone stronger and healthier than I was before. Melissa's story isn't over. She's still fighting her own demons in that psychiatric facility, still trapped in the delusional world she created. I feel pity for her sometimes, mixed with anger and fear and sadness for everyone involved. Her family reached out to me through Attorney Brennan about a year ago, apologizing for what their daughter had done, asking if there was anything they could do to make amends. I told them no, that I appreciated the gesture, but that I needed distance from anything connected to Melissa. They understood. I heard later they'd moved out of state, too ashamed and heartbroken to stay in a community where everyone knew what their daughter had done. Another set of victims in this mess, casualties of one person's unraveling mind. The craziest ex I've ever had to deal with literally lived in my ceiling. She stole my identity, framed me for federal crimes, and dismantled my life piece by piece while I slept beneath her. That's my answer to the question everyone asks at parties when stories of bad breakups come up. I usually don't tell the whole story, just enough to acknowledge it was bad without traumatizing whoever asked. But sometimes, with people I trust, I share more. I share how it changed me, how it taught me, how it ultimately made me more resilient and aware. I share because silence and shame are what people like Melissa count on. They're what allow dangerous behavior to continue unchecked. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.